Driving down Park Avenue, you are bound to notice the Scotch Plains Baptist Church. With its gothic-inspired architecture and historic graveyard, the Scotch Plains Baptist Church is not a sight you can miss.
I'm Reverend Chaz Hutchison. I'm the pastor here at Scotch Plains Baptist Church. I've been on staff here for almost 30 years now. I came as the youth pastor, have worn a couple different hats, and I'm now the senior pastor. And one of those hats that I've acquired is Scotch Plains Baptist Church history guy. So I have here the minute book of the Baptist Church that, as we open it, says the records of the Baptist Church at the Scotch Plains in East New Jersey in the year of our Lord, 1747. We know that William Darby had given a portion of his land in 1743 to have a burial ground, and that's where the first meeting house was built. But the folks from Scotch Plains actually attended church in Piscataway. And here on this page, the members' names. The first one listed, William Darby, Recompense Stanberry, Daniel Drake, Isaac Manning, John Dennis. This is the gravestone for the first pastor of Scotch Plains Baptist Church. It says, "Here lies the remains of the Reverend Mr. Benjamin Miller, minister of the gospel, who died November the 14th, 1781, aged 66 years. Really, the Scotch Plains Baptist Church has always been the Scotch Plains Baptist Church. As the church in the earliest days, it was a social gathering point. It was a key component for a lot of community members. Whether they really identified as Baptists or not, it was the only church in town. So you had the church and you had the tavern. So it was an important part of the social fabric, but always as a church. Now, the property did later contain the first school in Scotch Plains, but it was a separate entity from the church. Scotch Plains Baptist Church was officially chartered August 5th, 1747, with a small group of folks who had been dismissed from the Piscataway Baptist Church for the specific purpose of forming a congregation here in Scotch Plains. They used a building that was on the land of William Darby that had been built specifically to be a meeting house for the church. Unfortunately, that building eventually burned down. The church members made a deliberate effort to immediately begin a building fund, to build the building on their own. But history shows us that they eventually appealed to the public. Actually, this document is entitled, "To the Public." It says, "The church and congregation at the Scotch Plains beg leave to state their situation in respect to their meeting house." It goes on to explain that it had burned down, and their original intent was to rebuild it on their own. And the middle of the winter when it burned was a tough winter for everybody, and they didn't want to unduly burden anyone. Several months later, they realized they didn't have enough funds, and so they put out a subscription letter. Probably a series of subscription letters. And we have recognized here the name of Elias Stanberry of Rahway, pledging $3. Unfortunately, this particular subscription letter did not generate a whole lot because we have 2 blank pages. People often ask about the parsonage. The parsonage sits on land that was originally part of the William Darby farm, and William Darby's farmhouse sat right about where the parsonage is now. So they built the stone parsonage. It was known as the first stone parsonage in what was then Essex County. That parsonage was built in 1758 and has housed decades worth of pastors. The majority of the pastors of the church have actually lived in that house. This has been a burying ground for families associated with Scotch Plains Baptist Church. Some of the earliest stones might have just been simple field stones, may have been actually not stones at all, but made out of wood. And then later, sandstone would have become a popular carving stone, and would have been very popular up until marble, and then the more recent granite. Not only the the type of material changed, so did the styles. The earliest styles would have been simple lettering without a whole lot of ornamentation. We do have a couple of stones that have crossed bones. The simplest gravestone art is a skull and crossed bones. That style later morphed into what's known as the soul effigy. A lot of people call them cherubs. They look like little angel faces with wings coming out of the side. But they're called a soul effigy because if you look at them, their lips are always pursed and pudgy cheeks. It's because they're blowing out their last breath. The soul is leaving the body, and effigy as a representation. So it represents that here lies someone who has breathed their last breath, the soul has departed, and the wings indicate it's ascended to heaven. So that's often found on the tympanium, the top of the stone. On the bottom of the stone, you often find epitaphs. Sometimes short poems expressing loss, but quite often they were given as warnings. Just like the skull and crossbones is a sign of death, the epitaph was used as a warning that you need to prepare because you too will sometime die. Elizabeth Roll's stone says, "Remember me as you pass by. As you are now, so once was I. As I am now, so you must be. Therefore prepare to follow me." When the church was formed, it was formed of the local community. And just about everybody who was here was part of the church. So when you talk about Scotch Plains founding fathers, you naturally also talk about the members of Scotch Plains Baptist Church. Jonathan Hand Osborne, who was just a teenager at the time of the Revolutionary War, grew up to become a stone carver and carved a lot of the stones in the cemetery, some of them that still bear his signature on them, and also grew to be the clerk in the church. James Manning grew up here in town, went to school with Jonathan Hand Osborne in the two-story academy that was here on church property. James Manning went on to become an ordained minister, licensed and ordained here at Scotch Plains Baptist, married here at Scotch Plains Baptist, and then sent on behalf of Baptists to Rhode Island, where he founded the College of Rhode Island, which is now Brown University. So one of the things that's interesting when people read Scotch Plains Baptist history, often they pull out this line where the church decides to sell the seats in the church. And there's something about it that almost sounds like money was so tight they had to sell the benches right out of the church. But that's not what it means at all. It means that as a way to fund the work of the church, that they collected pew rent. So they would take the expected budget, they would divide it among the number of seats in the church and assign a dollar value to each seat, and families would subscribe to the budget by renting a pew. So here in the drawing of the second building, we see a variety of pew rents that if you sat up close, it was going to be $8, and as you got back, the first several were $8, and then $7.75, $7.50, $7.25, $7, all the way back to $4.50. But if you sat on the side, you can get a $3 seat over here or a $1.50 seat here. And so there was a prestige to being up front, being kind of in the middle of everything. To the point that even when folks moved away, they would sometimes leave a letter instructing that they were continuing to pay their pew rent, and the pastor can use the pews as he felt needed. Scotch Plains Township has a record of those who paid the slave tax as slaveholders. We think of the Drake House Museum in Plainfield and the wonderful connection and the history that comes there. The Drakes owned slaves. One of those slaves was a man by the name of Caesar. And Caesar lived to be over 100 years old. Now, he was freed by the Drakes in a will that after his owner died, his son inherited Caesar for a period of 5 years, and then was to basically retire Caesar along with a pension. So Caesar, as a freedman, when he heard the political rhetoric of all men being free, all men created equal, perhaps he thought that meant all men, and that it meant him as well. And he volunteered for the Revolutionary War. Now, often you hear of slaves who went in place of their master, or went in place of the master's son and served in their place in the war. Caesar was a freed man. He was a teamster, meaning that he mastered the team of horses that would pull a wagon to supply the camps. He was not an infantryman. He wasn't running around with a musket. He wasn't standing guard duty, but he was doing what he could for a cause in which he believed. Caesar lived to be over 100 years old, is buried in the cemetery with what would have been at the time the tallest tombstone in the cemetery. Interestingly enough, taller than that of Mr. Drake, his former owner. If you were to come along Park Avenue in front of the sanctuary, you'll find a large boulder, and on it has a DAR, Daughters of the American Revolution plaque that includes soldiers and patriots of the Revolutionary War. And there's a couple dozen names there, including Caesar. And his name just lists his name and the letters TMS for Teamster.
Despite being built over 200 years ago, the Scotch Plains Baptist Church continues to be in use today. Reverend Chaz Hutchison has worked with the Historical Society of Scotch Plains and Fanwood to ensure the preservation of the church's rich history.